going to show how to make hexagon graph paper using Affinity Photo's procedural texture filter. I made a previous video that showed how to make hexagon graph paper using Affinity Designer. A problem with using Affinity Designer to make the hexagon graph paper is that it's not really scalable. So if you want to change the size of the grid, you have to pretty much redraw all of the graph paper. With a procedural texture filter, you can just set it up and change a few of the parameters and instantly have a new grid filling all of the space. Another advantage of the procedural texture filter is you can create a shape in Designer and then insert the filter into that shape and instantly have a hexagon grid built into that shape. In order to make the hexagon grid, I'm going to make a mask that will consist of sort of stripes of white hexagon shapes and then alternating with black hexagon shapes. I'm going to reverse that, and then inside each one of the hexagons I'll put a little coordinate system. So then I'll have a coordinate grid, then I'll put a hexagon inside each one of those grid elements. To get started, I'll start with a new document, and I'm going to choose a letter, and I'm going to make it in portrait mode. Usually it's in CMYK mode. I'm going to change it to RGB mode. I'll create that and fill it with black. And then I'll add a live procedural texture filter. I'm going to start by adding a single equation and assigning it to all three channels. I will add a real number input A, and I'm going to call this the page height, and I'll set that to 11. This number of inches high my page is. I'll add another real input. I'm going to label that one with a D, and I'm going to have that be my divisions per inch. I'll set that to 1. I'm going to need the square root of 3 used in some of my calculations, and so I'm going to create a variable for that. I'll call it SR3 so I can remember what it is, and that is the square root of 3. I'm going to set up a scaling vector, var, SV, and that's a 2-element vector, and it's going to have 1 and the square root of 3 as the elements. Now I'm going to set up the initial coordinate system. It'll be var of v0, and that'll be a 2-element vector, and I'm going to use x and y instead of relative x and y, just so I'm going to add some sliders in here, and so I can position the position of the hexagon with sliders, and I think that'll be easier than just to drag them around with the mouse. I'm going to multiply by my page height, A, and also by my divisions per inch, D, and then I'm going to divide by H. Since I'm using the page height, I'll divide by H, so that's the height of the document in pixels. Now, I also have to divide this by the square root of 3, so I'll use my variable SR3, and then that'll be the coordinate system. Now I'm going to add the X and Y sliders so I can move this around. So I'll call this one X1, and I'll call this one Y1, and this is the X position and the Y position. I'll just set those both down to 0. We're going to add a vec2 that's a 2-element vector that consists of x1 and then y1 divided by the square root of 3. So my SR3 value. Now I can move these like that. Now I need to divide my page up into a series of rectangular grids. And so to do that, we're going to create a new variable, variable v1. That's equal to, I'm going to put a parentheses in here, and then I'm going to use fraction of v0. And to make it rectangular, I'm going to multiply by SV, and then I'm going to subtract 0.5 from that. When I multiplied by my scaling vector, it sort of distorted the coordinates, and I can restore those, but keep the grid the same by dividing by SV outside of the parentheses. So there's my rectangular grid. Now I have to create another rectangular grid that is offset by half a unit in each direction, x and y. So I'll set that up as variable v2, and that's equal to fraction of v0 times sv. But this time I'm adding 1/2, adding a 0.5, and subtracting 0.5, and then dividing by SV. That's the other coordinate system. Now I'm going to compare the length of vector v1 to vector v2, see which one's larger. And when you do that, you get a real interesting result. So let's do that. Okay, so I'm just going to look at this now, and I'll later set up my variable v3, but I'm going to take the length of v1, comma, length of v2. Okay, and so you can see on my image now, I've got a series of hexagonal black and white stripes. And if I look at the white one, so it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So that's my page height, number of hexagons across. The flat is arranged horizontally. So these are 1-inch hexagons across the flat. To finish this out, I need to create this into a vector. So I'll make it into a variable v3, and I'm going to multiply it by v1. And that will put the coordinate system in the middle of each of those hexagons. Now I have to create the opposite of this, and I could take 1 minus this pattern, but I sort of like doing it this way. So I'm going to add v2 times step of length of v2, comma, length of v1. And by doing that, I fill out the rest of the hexagon grid. So v3 is my hexagon coordinate system. Now I have to put a hexagon in the middle of each of those cells. So to get started, I'm going to start with absolute value of v3.y. And look at that. Now, if I took the step function of this, I could set it up where I'd have a series of horizontal lines at the edge of the hexagon. So I've got 2 of the edges of my hexagon done. I'm going to look at something else. It turns out if I take the dot product of the absolute value of v3, and if I swap the x and y components of my scaling vector, okay, so it's square root of 3 comma 1 instead of 1 comma square root of 3, I get that. So that gives me the other edges of my hexagon. To put those both together, I'm going to use the max function. I'm going to take the max of absolute value of v3.y and this dot product. And if I look at that, this line isn't coming through. And what I need to do is, if you remember, this one was a little darker. And it turns out I've got to multiply the absolute value of v3.y by 2 in order to get it up to the same size as the others. Okay, so now it looks better. They're all the same brightness, and so now I can enclose that into a step function. I'm going to add a 0 to 1 slider for the edge for my step function, and that's going to be the line width of my graph paper, how thick the line is on the graph paper. And then I'll add an S, and this will just be used to smooth it out a little bit, smooth out my graph paper. So now I'm going to use the smooth step function, and I'll use E and then E plus S divided by 10. And add another parentheses to the back of this. Now, I want the opposite of that, so I'm going to change from smooth step to smoothstepn. That will invert the image. So there I have my hexagon grid, and I can make that smooth. I can, if I want to change the scaling on it, all I have to do is adjust the divisions per inch. Up to 6 divisions per inch, and I may have to, adjust my line width a little bit. But basically that's working now. I can adjust the position of the hexagons with these sliders, and they'll go one complete cycle over. I scaled them to go over one complete cycle. Now I want to be able to have the flats oriented in the other direction. Now I could just rotate my paper and change this to an 8.5, but just for completeness, I'll show how to do that. So I'm going to add another equation. I'm going to copy this equation and paste it down here. I'm going to turn off the alpha and RGB and turn on the RGB down on this one. So to do this one, I need to change my scaling vector. Instead of 1, SR3, I'm going to have SR3, 1. Instead of absolute value of v3.y, I'm going to have absolute value of v3.x. And that's all there is to it. So now I have my hexagons ranged the other way, and I have this listed at 11, but you can see it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.5 across. So they're still 1-inch hexagons. And then I can easily change the divisions here. I'm going to add a gradient map. I have one set up for graph paper already, and I'm going to drag that onto the layer. Now let's say I wanted some smaller hexagons underneath the bigger hexagons. So to do that, all I have to do, I'll open this up. I'm going to duplicate my procedural texture filter. I'm going to change the overlay mode to multiply, and I'm going to change the divisions per inch to 6. I'm going to adjust the parameters a little bit. And if I wanted to, I could move these over so I could reposition these a little bit so they're aligned in a different way, however I want them. I could also change my gradient map so that these are, different colors. And I could change the opacity on this, and then I could get different colors for the different grids. To create the metric hexagon graph paper, I'm going to first save this equation so that I'll be able to pull it up in another document. Create a preset. I have a category for graph paper, and I'm going to choose temp for my file name. Now I'm going to choose File, New. I'm going to choose A4, which is 210 millimeters by 297 millimeters, and make sure that the color is in RGB mode. Usually it'll come up in CMYK mode, so you change that to RGB. Create that, fill that with black, and add a live procedural texture filter. I'm going to go and load the filter I just created. The height of this page is 297 millimeters. I'll put 297 in there. And this time, instead of divisions per inch, I'm going to change that to millimeters per division. And I'm going to set that to 18. Now, up here where I was multiplying by D, I'm going to change that to divide by D. And in the next equation too, divide by D. So that's symmetric graph paper. If I want to add that hexagon grid to some other shape that I made in Designer, I'll show you how to do that. So I'm in Designer. I'm going to start with a new document. I'll just leave it at letter 11 by 8.5, and it's set to RGB mode. I'll create that, and then I'm going to view the grid and look at the grid and axes. Look at basic, it's set to 1 inch and 1 inch divisions, and I'll just set that to 4, I guess, for now. So, alright, and then I can create some shapes on here. I'm going to lock that one. And maybe do some pen tool shapes. Like that. See, I'll unlock that one. Select it. Use my shape builder tool. Select the 3 shapes. Hit enter. And then click off it. I've got my shape. I'm going to go over and I'm going to choose the inch measurement. So you'll want to use either inch or metric, depending on which type of paper you have. You want to choose the same type of hexagon grid. I'm going to copy my procedural texture over there, over here, make sure I have this selected, paste that in. It adds a procedural texture on top of that. Now I'm going to make a copy of this. I'm going to duplicate it and bring it above the procedural texture, and then change the fill, no fill, the line of the stroke to 2 points. And so then it'll show up as an outline for my grid. And this is the page height, so I've got to make sure to change that to 8.5. Now I can adjust the position of the grid. Now, if I grab this shape and move it around, it doesn't move, my grid doesn't move with it. So that is one sort of defect, but I can reposition it after I get there with my sliders. This has the advantage that it fills up any space and you don't have to redraw it every time you want to fill a new space. You just have to call up the filter that you saved and adjust a few parameters. Let me know if you have any comments or questions, and thanks for watching.